Well, all right. Hello, and thank you all for tuning into yet another episode of the Professional Pricing Society podcast. Once again, my name is Terrence, and we have a great friend of PPS joining us today. His name is Barrett Thompson. Barrett actually leads the business solutions consultant team at Zilliant and has built and delivered optimization and pricing solutions for Fortune 500 businesses in diverse vertical industries. He also is a speaker and an author of a number of books. Barrett, how are we doing today?
Terrence, I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on the podcast again.
Good, good. Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you as always. Now, your upcoming talk at PPS is about a topic that most price professionals and B2B companies wish they never had to address, and that is the topic of price decreases. Why did you choose to discuss this topic with me today?
Well, you're right, Terrence, that most of the time, if the world can be up and to the right over time, that's where we want to be. And in fact, I think for most pricing folks, that's been the case probably in a lot of their professional career. But a season of price decreases is a very real possibility out there if you listen to some of the economic forecasts. And the last thing you want is to get caught flat-footed if that hits your business. So I thought that it might be timely, especially if the people listening and in the roles today have not been through a sustained and broad
Hmm.
and industry-wide or even planet-wide economic downturn. They might have no personal experience from which to draw. I think it was the last big global recession was around 2008, 2009, sort of kicked off then and took a few years. So that's 15 years ago. And we've
Sure.
got a lot of great professionals in the business that have come in since that time. And so they've probably been focused on year over year price increases, keeping up with inflation. And that may really be the thing that they're strong at. So I'm a Boy Scout and work with the Scouts still, Terrence. And our
Nice.
motto is be prepared.
Yeah.
And when you say be prepared for what, for anything really, for
Hmm.
whatever happens in business. So that is my motivation to bring this topic around systemic and intelligent price decreases.
That's good. That's good. It is a very timely matter. Price decreases always can be a timely discussion. So I'm glad that you are addressing this with us today. Now, let's talk about this. What's the difference? What's really the difference between price decreases and increases? Isn't that kind of the two sides of the same coin?
Yeah, it's a great question. And at some level, increases and decreases have a lot of similarity. I
Hmm.
say it in the sense that the core skills that a pricing professional uses to manage those increases are going
Hmm.
to be extremely valuable when they get into a season of pervasive decrease. An example of this, I see many businesses talking about and taking steps toward price automation as
Hmm.
one idea, using technology, for example, or making data-driven approaches, getting out of sort of a gut-driven instinct level price setting, or getting away from peanut butter spread price
Hmm.
changes and doing segmented and smart and surgical price changes. So those same ideas and concepts are going to apply in the decrease world, the price decrease world, but the details, how do you apply those, can vary dramatically in some cases when prices are dropping. So that's where it gets really interesting.
Hmm. That is interesting. Okay. That's very interesting. Now, is there any examples that you may have of a familiar concept that takes on a different form when it is applied to price decreases versus price increases?
Yes. Yeah, I'll tell you one that I think most people are familiar with. Every price professional that I speak with, they have a way to measure their year on year price change. And often they do that to show the improvement, if
Hmm.
you will, that the pricing team and the pricing program is bringing to the business. Now, the general form of that is to show the change in a key metric like average selling price or gross margins. But here's the expectation in a typical inflationary period. Probably everybody at the company has some rule of thumb that says, well, during inflationary times, if you took the gross margins up by 50 basis points,
Hmm.
maybe that's good. If you took it up by 100, it's great. If you did it by 200, it's outstanding, right? You're a
Hmm.
hero and you get the parade, the confetti parade. But and coupled with that, In that same inflationary period where we expect the number to go up, if you had to report that your overall number was negative, maybe minus 40 BPS on that gross margin year on year, that would be a shocker. It would be clearly a sign of failure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Positive numbers good, negative numbers bad. So if that's how you're thinking about measuring your price performance, what's going to happen when you flip into that recessionary world? And the assumption is already set that prices are going to decrease. So
Mm-hmm.
right away, like you're not going to be reporting a positive number. So that
Mm-hmm.
may be obvious, but it's sort of very different. So you're like, well, now wait a minute. I'm going to be reporting a negative year on year change in margin due to pressure. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you report that same minus 40 bips, that would have been bad under the inflationary world, but now we're in the deflationary world. You report minus 40. Okay, here's the quiz. Are you a hero or a zero at that moment? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, I think nobody knows, or they might not know inside that business. They might have no instinct about what good looks like in that kind of economic condition where prices are going down.
Mm-hmm.
So, let me offer how I've seen some people address that. For example, if they might have had an industry report
Mm-hmm.
showing that in their industry, their competitors experienced an average margin loss of 100 bips in the downturn. So, hey, in that case, you've done far better than your peers. So even though you're negative, you're good,
Mm-hmm.
right? I would think so. I mean, that's perfectly legit. Or it might be the case that your financial planning team at the beginning of the year, they had a forecast of this margin pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And they might have actually built in a loss in margin rate into the financial plan, just being realistic.
Mm-hmm.
So what if they planned, however, to take only a 20 basis point loss on margin? That's what they built into the finance plan.
Mm-hmm.
And you delivered twice that. I mean, you lost twice as much as they expected. So they might say, well, hang on a minute, you missed plan,
Mm-hmm.
right? So these ideas and these examples show that you're going to need to think carefully about how you plan with other stakeholders. How will you judge price effectiveness of your price program over time in a recessionary environment, since we cannot just say if the margin rates or the average selling prices go up, I must be good. And if they go down, I must be bad. That logic isn't going to fly anymore. And so you have to think a little differently, plan ahead, decide what your anchor points are going to be so you can measure yourself against it. Because in the deflationary world, the assumption is those key metrics are going to go down. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a little that's one example of how you're used to measuring, but the way in which you measure and define good and bad needs to be thought through a little more carefully in the recessionary world.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. That actually makes a lot of sense, and it's especially for recessionary times. Um, that's a very interesting example that you provided. Now, let me ask you this: how does the goal or the tactics of pricing of the pricing team change during recessionary times?
I'll offer with a what I admit is a bit of an oversimplification, but I sort of think of it like this. And we'll start with the inflationary time and then we'll contrast.
Okay.
In the inflationary time, the general goal is to raise your prices as much as possible without putting your revenues at risk. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I think most pricing teams are inherently seeking this. They're trying to find that glass ceiling of prices, right? What's the highest amount I can charge? And of course, I want to move there as quickly as I can, but I
Mm-hmm.
still want to hit other objectives. I have a revenue objective, a market share objective, so I don't want to compromise those. But we talk about leaving money on the table. The pricing team is essentially saying, how can I take that money off the table? Where is it? Somebody tell me how much it is and let me go grab it and bring it back to my own company in the way I
Mm-hmm.
increase my prices smartly. So all that makes sense, but that's during the inflationary time. You want to take that money
Sure.
off the table, put it back in your pocket. But now let's flip over and look at the deflationary time.
Mm-hmm.
The goal is fundamentally different. If you know your prices are going down, you are effectively putting money onto that table, right? You're putting it on, you're giving it away in some form.
Mm-hmm.
You're not taking it back. And so here is how your tactic changes. You want to give away the least amount possible, and you want to give it away at the latest possible time. That's the mindset you have to have. How can I lower prices just enough, but no further? And I want to delay that price decrease to the latest possible moment in order to hit my other goals, revenue and share and so on. And your competitors are doing this too. And so you can think of this as like a game of mutual bloodletting, if I could say it that way, right? He
Mm-hmm.
who bleeds the least is actually the winner. So your job as a pricer in the deflationary environment is honestly and transparently, you're going to be bleeding off price, you're going to be bleeding off margin, and you want to do just enough, but not too much. You want to avoid being the first one to race to the bottom. We've all heard
Mm-hmm.
that. It's certainly true here. So you have to work hard to be sure that you're not overshooting by the amount of those price decreases you give or the timing with which you give them. And so that really inverts, the tactics that the pricing teams are
Mm-hmm.
generally using in the normal, if you will, normal inflationary period.
Mm. Okay, that's good. So to put the least amount on the table, um, at the furthest time is what you're saying. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. You
Okay.
you know you're going to have to give something because
Yep.
they're going to be again, there's an assumption around this inflationary or sorry, deflationary period is that price pressure means prices are going down overall. They're going down more often than they're going up. So you have to
Mm-hmm.
figure out where do I need to take that price decrease? How much is just enough? Not too much. And then you don't want to lead too early. You don't want to
Mm-hmm.
give a price move, 6 months before your competitors do it. Not if it's downward. You don't
Sure.
want to give it away yet, right? So the timing is going to matter there as well.
For sure. Sure. Okay. Putting the least amount on the table, the latest amount of time. Now let me ask you this. What happens if I overplay this hand of mine and I hold back on a price a little too much, or I hold out on a higher price longer than I probably should? Does that does that hurt me?
Yeah, that's really the risk, right? It is this balancing game and a game of judgment because it will. You can get burned on either side. So let's use this example you gave. What if I'm hanging on to a high price
Mm-hmm.
in a market where the prices are decreasing? How does that hurt me? If my price is too high or I hang on to it for too long, how does that hurt me? The way I think about it is you might have to ask like a correlated question, and that is what is the scope of that price mistake that I'm making? An example is if I have 10,000 SKUs in my catalog and it's only a handful, a
Mm-hmm.
dozen SKUs, where I'm kind of got the wrong too high of a price or I'm hanging on to it for too long. What might that mean when somebody comes to my website and they're filling out that order, putting things in the basket? Maybe I lose one item on the order,
Mm-hmm.
and that has some impact, but it's not the end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what happens if it's a bit more pervasive? And I've got several product categories or hundreds of products that are mispriced, and maybe some products that are very visible. I do a high volume on those. Well, back to this example, my e-commerce customer, I might lose several products. And in fact, if they're filling out the order online, they might say, gosh, you don't have much of anything I need priced the way I want to buy it. So you might lose the order itself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that could be a one-time thing, right? They come to you in January for replenishment. You didn't have the prices right. You were too high. You were too late with your price move. So you lost the January order. If they've been doing business with you for 5 years, 10 years, they're likely to come back in Feb and just try again, see if you sort of got it right, see if you got synced up. But what if you didn't? What if you continue in a pervasive way and over time, you're always lagging the market in terms of taking that price down when the others are going down, and you never seem to get in line with the market level? Well, after the customer comes a couple of three times and gives you a chance to get serious and get it right, and they see that you're not, and they've given up several orders, at some point, they're just going to move on as a customer. They're going to decide that you're not the vendor for them. And then if your situation is really pervasive, I mean, major parts of your catalog out of whack, you're hanging on to prices many months longer than you should, then you're not going to lose just one customer, right? You're going to lose many customers, and that's
Mm,
tantamount to losing a market. So the 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 impact that it has, how much it hurts you to be too high or too late on your price move, is largely dependent on how often you're making that mistake, on how many products and how long are you hanging on to that mistake.
mm. Wow. Well, that makes a lot of sense as well. Holding out for too long can come back to bite you in the butt, essentially, and not just with customers or clients starting to potentially question if your product is worth that value or not. But
Right.
it could move them towards them as a customer moving on from your product. And then the worst case scenario is, as you said, losing many customers, essentially losing a market as a whole. And so, huh, it's
Yeah,
a lot.
there's some tolerance for like occasionally I don't have the numbers quite right. You
Sure,
could
sure.
take some bumps and rattles here and there, and you can work that out over time. The market is likely more forgiving of
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
But if you show in a big way, like every time they add something to the cart, you're 15% higher than the other guys, and you seem to,
Hmm.
even though you might say to yourself, well, I have taken my prices down, since the beginning of the year. Yes, but if you've only taken them down half as much as someone else,
Hmm.
or you've taken it down on half the products, but you've missed the other half. You thought you could hold on to it. These things are always asymmetric.
Sure.
You'll need to drop more in some areas than others. That's true. Hopefully you can judge each of those appropriately. But let's say if you get it right half the time, you miss it half the time, and you stick with that, that's going to be more obvious than if you occasionally, have a blip
Yeah.
and then you catch it up in the next cycle.
Yeah.
So it's a balancing act.
For sure.
Takes a lot of finesse. It takes a way to sense what's going on. Watching the order streams, watching win-loss rates, looking at, well, if we're using e-commerce, for example, even monitoring, cart abandonment rates would be
Mm.
incredibly useful information. But even getting feedback from customer service reps and field sales reps on the kind of thing that the market and the customers are saying when you went in with that line item and you went in with that price. If you're way out of line, you're likely to hear that. And if you hear that from several places, several different customers in
Yep.
close proximity and time, you know, you can
Yeah.
begin to trust that signal.
Sure. Yeah. If the pattern's there, it's likely true.
Right.
Now, it seems that you're fairly deep in your exposure on price decreases. Let me ask, if you don't mind me asking, where did you get that exposure since most of the time the pricing function is centered around increases?
Yeah, I too have realized so many B2B businesses, and in their normal times, right? It's up and to the right, as we said at the beginning.
Mm,
And that's great in the growth market. But interestingly, Terrence, even in what we would consider times of growth, when the economy is not in a recession or not under this kind of pressure, there are specific industries whose natural state is that of decreasing prices over time, sometimes
mm,
radically decreasing prices.
mm,
And I know that might seem a bit odd to folks here who are, maybe if you're in industrial manufacturing or you are in certain kinds of distribution, building supplies or something like that, you do not see routine price decreases year on year in a
mm,
stable or normal or growth market. You see increases, right, in the inflationary world.
mm,
But in semiconductors,
mm,
particularly the manufacturers making the CPUs and memory chips and so on, LED lighting also went through
mm,
this, and I think is still in it several years ago when there was a big conversion out of, you know, incandescent and fluorescent to LED lighting. Because that's a high tech thing, a lot like semiconductors,
mm,
every quarter and every year prices were dropping double digit,
mm,
period on
mm,
period. And so out of those industries, when I've worked with those kind of customers and when I've talked with them about their needs and kind of gotten in sync with how they think about approaching their pricing, since this is where they live all the time. This is
mm,
what they live every month and every quarter is deflationary prices. That's where I've been able to glean some of my best understandings about what are the strategies and tactics that should be used when any B2B company is in a deflationary period, even if that might be the exception for them. It's the norm for someone else. So I've done my best to pick up on the practices that work and distill those down and compare them to what is usually experienced in the price increase world.
Hmm.
So that informs my perspective, and I'm looking forward to sharing more of the ideas and strategies that I've learned from these industries at my PPS session coming up in October.
Mr. Barrett Thompson, everybody, you are full of knowledge on this topic, and you would be considered an expert in this realm. So I want to thank you so much for being on this podcast with us. Barrett Thompson is going to be with us at our Atlanta conference coming up in October, specifically October 10th through the 13th. But make sure you guys take the time to visit our website, priceandsociety.com, and visit the conferences tab to learn more about the upcoming conference, the guest speakers who are going to be in attendance, and what you can expect. Now, Barrett, one more question before I let you go. Where can people learn more about you or read more about what you stand for, who you work with, and just all things Barrett Thompson?
Well, I encourage them to connect with me on LinkedIn. You'll see my profile there at Barrett Thompson, 2 R's and 2 T's in the first name. And I'll be happy to make your connection. And also, I look forward to seeing you at the PPS event. If come by, see me at the session or see me at the Zilliant booth on the vendor hall, and let's be sure we trade contact information. I look forward to seeing you all there.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. Until next time, have a good one.